For decades, historians and curious readers have asked a strange and uncomfortable question. Did Adolf Hitler ever have a child? Officially, the answer is simple. According to most historical records, Adolf Hitler never had children. He married his longtime partner, Eva Braun, only in the final hours of his life in April 1945, inside the bunker beneath Berlin. Less than 40 hours later, both of them were dead. No birth certificates, no acknowledged children, no family line. But history is rarely that simple. For many years, rumors have circulated about a man who claimed to be Hitler's biological son. A man who grew up in France, lived through World War II, and later wrote a book describing his life story. His name was Jean-Marie Loret, and according to him, his father was none other than Adolf Hitler himself. To many people, the claim sounded unbelievable. But others believed there were small details that made the story worth investigating. Historians, journalists, and even genetic researchers would later spend decades trying to determine whether this strange story could possibly be true. But before we explore the mystery of Jean-Marie Loret, we first need to understand something surprising about Adolf Hitler himself. Despite his reputation as one of history's most brutal dictators, Hitler had a very different public image when it came to children. Photographs and film footage from the 1930s and early 1940s often show Hitler surrounded by smiling children. In many of these images, he appears relaxed, even affectionate. Children would approach him, shake his hand, or sit beside him during public events. Some children who lived near Hitler's inner circle even called him Uncle Adolf. This nickname wasn't unusual in the environment around him. Hitler frequently spent time with the families of high-ranking Nazi officials. Many of these officials brought their children to social gatherings at Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria. Among them were the children of Martin Bormann, one of Hitler's most powerful political secretaries, and Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi regime's propaganda minister. The Goebbels family in particular was very close to Hitler. Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda had 6 children, and they were often photographed visiting Hitler. In some images, Hitler can be seen holding their hands, smiling beside them, or posing for family-style photographs. These scenes were carefully used by Nazi propaganda to show a softer side of the German leader, a man who appeared kind, calm, and protective of the younger generation. But historians believe these images were also genuine moments of interaction. Hitler did seem to enjoy spending time with children, especially those belonging to families he trusted. Many of these moments were recorded at Hitler's famous Alpine residence known as the Berghof. The Berghof was located in the Bavarian Alps and served as Hitler's private mountain home. It was a place where high-ranking Nazi officials gathered, where political conversations took place, and where social events were held. Guests would arrive with their families, and children often played on the surrounding lawns while adults talked politics inside the villa. Film footage from the Berghof shows a relaxed environment, far removed from the harsh image of Nazi power seen in war footage. Children ran through gardens, dogs played on the grass, and Hitler, at least in those moments, looked almost like an ordinary host. Yet despite these many photographs and films, there is no historical evidence that Hitler ever fathered a child with his partner, Eva Braun. Eva Braun had been in a relationship with Hitler for more than a decade before the end of World War II. She lived much of her life quietly in the background of Hitler's world, rarely appearing in official Nazi propaganda. While Hitler maintained a public image of being devoted entirely to Germany, Eva Braun remained his private companion. But historians who studied their relationship found no credible evidence that Eva Braun ever became pregnant or gave birth. In fact, many accounts suggest that Hitler deliberately avoided the responsibilities of family life. He often portrayed himself as a man who had married Germany. According to some of his statements, he believed that having a traditional family might distract him from his political mission. This carefully constructed image helped reinforce the idea that Hitler's entire life was dedicated to the Nazi state. So, if Hitler never had children with Eva Braun, Where did the rumor about a son come from? That story begins decades earlier, during the chaos of the First World War. In 1914, Adolf Hitler was a young man living in Germany. When the war began, he volunteered for the German army and was assigned to serve on the Western Front. For 4 years, he worked as a messenger soldier, carrying messages between military units under extremely dangerous conditions. The Western Front stretched across parts of France and Belgium, and soldiers spent long periods stationed near small towns and villages. During those years, relationships sometimes formed between German soldiers and local women. These relationships were often brief and complicated by the harsh conditions of wartime life. Sometimes they resulted in children. And according to one controversial claim, one of those children may have been born in France in 1918. That child would later grow up to become Jean-Marie Loret. Loret was born in March 1918 in northern France. His mother was a young Frenchwoman named Charlotte Lobjoy. For most of his childhood, Loret believed he was the son of another man. But according to his later accounts, his mother eventually told him a shocking story. She claimed that during World War I, she had a brief relationship with a German soldier. And that soldier, she said, was Adolf Hitler. At the time, Hitler was still an unknown figure, just another soldier in the German army. Years later, however, he would rise to power and become one of the most infamous leaders in world history. If Charlotte's story was true, it would mean that Adolf Hitler fathered a child years before becoming the dictator of Nazi Germany. But was the story real? Or was it just another legend created by the chaos of war and the myths that followed it? To answer that question, historians would later begin examining the life of Jean-Marie Loret in extraordinary detail. And what they discovered only made the mystery deeper. Because some events in Loret's life during World War II were unusual. By the time the Second World War began in 1939, Jean-Marie Loret was already a young adult living in France. At that point in his life, he did not publicly claim to be the son of Adolf Hitler. In fact, according to many accounts, he still believed that another man was his father. Like millions of young Europeans of his generation, Loret's life was soon shaped by the outbreak of war. In 1936, several years before the German invasion of France, Loret had joined the French army. When World War II erupted in 1939, he served as a soldier like many other Frenchmen preparing to defend their country. But the German army moved quickly. In May 1940, German forces launched a massive offensive against France in the Low Countries. Within weeks, the French military collapsed. Paris fell to the Germans, and France was divided between the German-occupied north and the Vichy government in the south. During this chaotic period, Jean-Marie Loret was captured by German forces and taken prisoner. For many French soldiers, captivity meant years in prison camps in Germany. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners remained in those camps for most of the war. But according to several accounts about Loret's life, something unusual happened. He was reportedly released from captivity much earlier than many other prisoners. Why? Some later writers would suggest that this early release might have been the result of special intervention. But there is no official document proving that Adolf Hitler himself had anything to do with it. After his release, Loret returned to life in occupied France. During the German occupation between 1940 and 1944, daily life in France was tightly controlled by German authorities. Police forces operated under both French and German supervision, and collaboration with the occupying power became a complicated and controversial issue. Some records suggest that he held administrative responsibilities at a relatively young age. For a man in his early 20s, this was considered an unusual level of responsibility, especially in a period when political loyalty and security concerns dominated government institutions. Even more curious were Loret's own later claims about his interactions with German authorities. According to his personal account, he sometimes had access to places that ordinary French citizens rarely entered, including offices connected to the German security apparatus. Some descriptions even suggested that he visited facilities used by the Gestapo in Paris. The Gestapo, the secret police of Nazi Germany, operated under the authority of Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime. For most civilians in occupied Europe, contact with the Gestapo was something to fear, not something that provided privileges or friendly connections. Yet in later years, Loret claimed that his interactions with German officials during the occupation were relatively smooth and cooperative. To some observers, these claims raised an obvious question. Could the German authorities have known something about his identity? Or were these stories simply exaggerations told years after the war? The mystery deepened further when historians examined the memoirs of people who had worked closely with Adolf Hitler. One of those people was Heinz Linge, Hitler's personal valet and assistant, who served him for many years inside the Nazi leadership circle. After the war, Linge wrote memoirs describing various moments from Hitler's life and conversations. In one entry, he mentioned an event from June 1940, shortly after France had been defeated by Germany. According to that account, Adolf Hitler allegedly asked Heinrich Himmler to arrange housing or support for a French woman named Charlotte and her son. For some researchers, this detail immediately raised suspicions. Charlotte was the name of Jean-Marie Loret's mother. But there is an important problem with this story. The reference appears only in Linge's memoirs. So far, historians have not found independent archival documents confirming that such an order was ever given by Hitler or Himmler. Memoirs written many years after events can sometimes contain mistakes, memory errors, or interpretations shaped by later events. So while the story is intriguing, historians treat it cautiously. Meanwhile, another set of claims came directly from Jean-Marie Loret himself. According to Loret, his mother Charlotte had once received money and gifts from Adolf Hitler after their alleged relationship during World War I. He said that during his childhood he did not understand the source of these gifts. Only later did his mother supposedly reveal the story about the German soldiers she had known during the war. If true, this would suggest that Hitler might have known about the child. But again, no official financial records have ever been discovered to prove that such support actually existed. Still, small coincidences continued to attract attention. During the German occupation, Loret was able to continue working in administrative positions, while many other French citizens faced restrictions, forced labor, or persecution. Some historians wondered whether these circumstances reflected ordinary wartime bureaucracy, or something more unusual. However, it is also important to remember that occupied France was a complex and chaotic environment. Many people worked in administrative roles without having any special relationship with German authorities. Survival often required cooperation with local systems of control, even for people who privately opposed the occupation. In fact, some later sources even claim that Jean-Marie Loret eventually joined elements of the French resistance toward the later years of the war. If that claim is true, it would mean that Loret's wartime experiences were far more complicated than the simple story of collaboration. Like many Europeans during World War II, he may have navigated a dangerous and morally complex environment where survival required constant adjustment. But the real turning point in the story did not occur during the war itself. It happened years later. For decades after the war ended in 1945, Jean-Marie Loret lived a relatively quiet life. But eventually, he began to speak publicly about the story his mother had told him. And when he did, the world finally heard his claim. Jean-Marie Loret believed that Adolf Hitler was his biological father. To support his claim, he gathered photographs, personal documents, and testimonies that he believed connected his mother to the young German soldier who later became one of the most infamous figures in history. In the 1980s, he even published a book describing his life and the story he had been told. The book brought international attention to the claim. Journalists, historians, and curious readers all began asking the same question. Could it really be possible that Adolf Hitler had a secret son living in France? At first, the answer seemed impossible to prove. But by the late 20th century, science had developed a new tool that might finally reveal the truth: DNA analysis. And when scientists eventually examined the genetic evidence connected to Jean-Marie Loret, the results would bring the investigation closer to a final answer. But not everyone would agree on what that answer meant. By the late 20th century, the story of Jean-Marie Loret had already circulated among historians for many years. Some people believed his claim might be true, while others dismissed it as another strange legend connected to the life of Adolf Hitler. But for a long time, there was no reliable way to test the claim scientifically. Historical documents can be lost. Memories can be wrong. Stories can change over time. What historians needed was something more objective. They needed science. And by the early 2000s, modern genetics had finally made it possible to examine historical mysteries using DNA analysis. If Jean-Marie Loret truly was the biological son of Adolf Hitler, his genetic material should share specific markers with known relatives from Hitler's family line. Researchers began searching for biological samples that could be tested. One of the most unusual pieces of evidence reportedly came from something very small: a postage stamp. According to investigators, Jean-Marie Loret had once mailed a letter, and the envelope still contained a stamp that he had licked decades earlier. Scientists believed they could extract traces of his DNA from the saliva left on that stamp. If successful, that DNA could then be compared to genetic material from people known to be related to Adolf Hitler. The test was eventually carried out in 2008 by a Belgian journalist and researcher named Jean-Paul Mulders, working with genetic specialists. Their goal was simple: determine whether the genetic profile of Jean-Marie Loret matched the male line of Hitler's known relatives. To do this, scientists compared Loret's DNA with DNA samples taken from individuals who belonged to Hitler's extended family. If the claim were true, the results should show a clear genetic connection. But the results told a different story. According to the published findings, the DNA from Jean-Marie Loret did not match the genetic markers associated with Hitler's family line. In other words, the scientific evidence suggested that Loret was not biologically related to Adolf Hitler. For many historians, this result was the strongest piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Unlike personal memories, political rumors, or wartime anecdotes, DNA analysis provides a direct biological comparison. And the comparison showed no connection. However, the story did not completely end there. Some critics argued that historical DNA evidence can sometimes be complicated. For example, the sample from the postage stamp raised questions about the chain of custody, meaning whether the stamp had truly been used by Loret and whether it had been preserved without contamination. While most researchers considered the sample reliable, others argued that additional tests would be useful to confirm the conclusion. Another small development occurred years later. In 2018, reports emerged that a DNA test had been conducted on Philippe Loret, the son of Jean-Marie Loret. Because children inherit half of their genetic material from their parents, a comparison between Philippe Loret and known relatives of Hitler could potentially provide another opportunity to verify the claim. But the results of that test were never made public. They were reportedly kept private, and without access to the data, historians cannot evaluate what the test actually showed. As a result, the 2008 DNA analysis remains the most widely discussed scientific investigation connected to the claim. And according to that analysis, the genetic evidence does not support the idea that Jean-Marie Loret was Hitler's son. When historians combine this genetic evidence with the historical record, the overall conclusion becomes clearer. There is no reliable document proving that Adolf Hitler ever had a child. There are no birth records linking him to a son. There are no confirmed letters or financial documents demonstrating that he supported a child in France. and the strongest scientific test available so far does not show a genetic connection. Taken together, these facts have led most modern historians to the same conclusion. Adolf Hitler almost certainly did not have any known biological children. Yet the story of Jean-Marie Loret remains fascinating for another reason. It shows how history, memory, and myth can sometimes become entangled. During and after World War II, the world struggled to understand the life and personality of Adolf Hitler. Many questions about his private life remained unanswered. In that environment, rumors and stories naturally appeared. Some of those stories grew larger over time, especially when they involved dramatic possibilities, like the idea that one of the most infamous leaders in human history secretly had a son. For Jean-Marie Loret himself, the story was deeply personal. According to people who knew him, he genuinely believed the story his mother had told him. Whether she had misunderstood the identity of the soldier she met during World War I, or whether the story changed over time, remains impossible to know with certainty. But from a historical and scientific perspective, the evidence today points in one direction. The claim that Jean-Marie Loret was the son of Adolf Hitler remains unproven, and most likely false. In the end, the mystery teaches us something important about history. Even when stories are dramatic and compelling, the truth must be tested carefully through documents, evidence, and science. And sometimes, the most powerful answer history can give us is simply this: there is no proof. For now, the historical record still stands. Adolf Hitler died in April 1945 inside his bunker in Berlin. He left behind a devastated Europe, millions of victims of war and genocide, and one of the darkest legacies in modern history. But when it comes to family, children, and descendants, history suggests that Adolf Hitler left none. And perhaps that is one of the few mysteries about him that history has finally been able to resolve.